will sound like mostly a new talk to you. This is basically a talk that I give to the medical students and the residents at the U. And it's medicine and politics because, as you all know, marijuana has a lot of political issues that have to deal with a lot of things going on in our society. Let's see if I can go to the next slide here. There we go. My background, I specialize in epilepsy. I'm a professor of neurology and pharmacy at the university. That's another story in itself. It's unusual to have two appointments at the university, but what it does for me is nobody owns me. So when I'm at, if I'm not around in neurology, I think I'm in pharmacy, but I could be anywhere. So I've done mostly drug development for the last 45 years. Done a lot of clinical trials. You probably hear about FDA approval for trials. I've been involved with the FDA quite a bit through this stuff. And then in the past, I've been president of the American Epilepsy Society and some other stuff too. And so I've always had sort of an interest in what's going on in politics. And that's sort of where I get some of the information I'm going to talk about. Let's see here. That should go to the next slide.
The arrow to the right?
Yep, there we go. Got it. Wrong arrow. Got it. Oh, no, I went backwards.
Go to the arrow to the right. You've got 4 arrows there.
There we go. Okay, so I've learned a long time ago that it's really hard to get attention of people, medical students and pharmacy students. So I decided to talk about pizza, which is always a fun topic. But the question really is, why do I talk about pizza when I'm supposed to be talking about cannabis? And if you really want to know the answer, you'll have to stay awake for the next half hour thereabouts. So I really do oppose what's known as medical marijuana. And there are many reasons. The first reason is most states that have a medical marijuana bill require the patient, the physician, to make a diagnosis that fits the state standards allowing the use of medical marijuana. And so that puts a lot of doctors in states like California under a lot of pressure. People come in and, you never know quite truly whether they're making up stories. And this is one of the issues that happened in Minnesota. A lot of doctors in Minnesota were very, very concerned that we would have tons of patients coming in wanting medical marijuana in Minnesota for recreational purposes. That didn't happen, actually. The other problem is I do epilepsy, and if you were going to use medical marijuana for epilepsy, you'd have to be high all the time. And the last thing we want to do is have our patients high all the time. And the other real problem is that when you're using the total weed, you really don't know what doses you're getting. And some of the genetic variants that have been crossbred have almost 35% of THC, which is a really high amount of THC. The natural variety runs maybe 5% at the most. So I used to use this analogy when I was on TV and radio and others, and medical marijuana is like bread mold for pneumonia. So years ago, doctors used to actually give bread mold if you had pneumonia because we didn't have a penicillin pill. But who today would want to use moldy bread for pneumonia? Raise your hands if you want to do moldy bread for pneumonia. So why the hell would you want to do medical marijuana when you have a pill available today in Minnesota? So that's really the rationale. The medical cannabis in Minnesota is where you take out the active ingredients of the cannabis plant, you make them into purified form, you check them for quality, you check them for impurities, and so it really is very analogous to the purified penicillin pill instead of the bread mold. Cannabis, the marijuana plant has approximately 400 different chemicals, some of which are actually carcinogenic. And this is something that isn't widely spread around. but some of the terpenes are carcinogenic. But the two major ingredients of interest are tetrahydrocannabinol or 9-THC, which is the usual way it's referred to, but there are other THCs in there too, and it's a very complicated chemical thing. The THC has been useful for management of nausea and vomiting and loss of appetite in cancer patients. There's no question that that's really been the major push for using medical marijuana. The other thing that is in in cannabis is cannabidiol. Now, this is a very interesting chemical because it is entirely different than THC in terms of its property. It does not cause any behavioral changes. It causes no high, and this has been very thoroughly tested. So it is really approved now for epileptic seizures. There's actually currently an FDA-approved formula for epileptic seizures that insurance pays for. So in Minnesota, you may remember back in 2013, 10 years ago, the medical marijuana people came into the state and they were pushing medical marijuana and they would make the whole plant available for medical use if you smoked. MDs would still have to certify patients that they had the medical conditions, and they were pushing it for pain, nausea, epilepsy, etc. And then once the MD certified the patient, they could go to the distributors and get the quote medical marijuana. But there was a lot of opposition from law enforcement, and the Minnesota Medical Society was really quite opposed to this. Medical Society is opposed to mostly because of the issues we talked about earlier, which is smoking the weed, which has got a lot of negative Minnesota issues. So I got involved in this because the first bill was defeated, and it was defeated because there's no need for legalizing marijuana for nausea from cancer chemotherapy, because way back in 1988, the FDA approved the synthetic THC. So what's sort of strange is that an awful lot of people have never heard that there is an FDA-approved THC pill. The cancer doctors are using this quite a bit, but even a lot of the medical students don't know that this is available for years. So there's really no medical reason to have medical marijuana, quote unquote, for cancer pain. I had an acquaintance who actually did have cancer, took the THC Marinol pill, and said, gee, it gave me the same high that I had when I was in college. But at that time he was fighting cancer. He didn't really like the high part, but it did work for the nausea. But then the medical marijuana people turned around, and some of you may remember around that time, there was this little girl in Colorado that had really, really bad epilepsy. Her name was Charlotte. And somebody gave her the oil, the CBD oil, and she did really well. She has a type of epilepsy that is helped by CBD, and she was on Sanjay Gupta, and the medical marijuana people jumped on epilepsy right away, and that's sort of how I got involved in the battle. And Peggy and I was on TV a couple of times, and Peggy and I were on the radio a few times, and Peggy was there when we got the medical marijuana person to say that medical marijuana is really a smokescreen for recreational. Yeah. So, but anyway, make a long story short, Minnesota did pass a bill, $2 million a year. There's a marijuana board set up that has a medical director. They selected manufacturers, and the board monitors the manufacturing distribution. Manufacturers have to make a liquid extract containing the purified compound. They need to grow the plant. They have to purify the chemicals, and they have to make it pharmaceutical grade. And this is not an easy process. This is the most restrictive law in the U.S. New York and other states have passed similar laws lately. So here's how the Minnesota law works. First of all, the patient has to go to a physician or a healthcare practitioner. Nurses can also certify people. And once the medical person has certified that the person has a condition, we fill out a 2-minute form on the internet giving the patient's name and contact information and send it to the state. The state then sends the patient another form where the patient swears they're not doing any illegal drugs and are not a criminal, et cetera, et cetera. And once the state registers them, they go to a dispensary. And this is an old slide. There used to be just a handful of distributors. There are now 2 major manufacturers, but they've opened up distribution sites more or less all over the state. So then the patient can go to the distributor and get the pill, liquid, or oil. And they can get it vaped, or they can get a skin cream, or they can get a capsule. I like personally the capsule myself. In Minnesota, there are 17 conditions allowing for cannabis to be used. You know, some of these are not really medically proven. So how do these things get on the list? Patient lobbying groups lobby the Minnesota State Board to have their condition listed. Glaucoma, there's very little evidence for glaucoma. Pain, there's a lot of evidence. Tourette syndrome, not so much. HIV/AIDS was ALS was lobbied for because there's really no treatment for ALS, and the ALS people really pushed to have ALS on the list. But the 2 that have a lot of medical background are seizures and the pain associated with multiple sclerosis. And then also Crohn's disease seems to be helped, and then obviously terminal illness. So they've just added post-traumatic stress syndrome as well. So these are conditions that the state has approved. Now people are always wondering what's going on with the FDA versus states. And as you know, we live in a sort of interesting situation. We have a federal government, but when there were 13 states, the states also wanted to have states' rights. So the states have retained a lot of rights. The FDA was set up under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to allow interstate activity. So in other words, if you're a company in Massachusetts that are manufacturing some kind of widget, you don't want to have to go to every state and get approval to market that widget. So you can get approval to market the widget all over the United States, but the Commerce Clause controls advertising. And so, like, I don't know how many of you saw the thing yesterday, but there's now a JR-15, Junior AR-15, that's being advertised, which is a lightweight AR-15 designed for kids. And there's a lot of concern now that this is being advertised, and the Commerce Commission is looking into seeing whether they can actually advertise this for kids or not. But Illinois has already banned advertising for it. So the FDA is set up to regulate the advertising and marketing of drugs. So you've all seen those ads on TV. You know, everybody's happy and dancing around and doing whatever, but then you hear all of the things that, you know, are the dangers. And the reason for that is, for many years you could not advertise drugs on TV, but the manufacturers sued and won. But the FDA then said, well, okay, we'll let you advertise, but you can't just sell this stuff without the warnings. And so that's why you have all the warnings. So make a long story short, the FDA then controls interstate commerce, and most FDA-approved drugs can be sold anywhere in the United States. But the states can also regulate what pills are sold. And so every state has the ability with the state legislature to say, okay, in Minnesota, you can sell this product for medical use, but you can't take it across state lines. So there are lots of examples. Right now, the big argument, obviously, is the abortion pill. So states can say you can use the abortion pill in Minnesota, but you can't in Texas. And there's some really weird things going on. There's one epilepsy drug that used to be Schedule 5. FDA decided it's not dangerous, so federally it's not a Schedule 5. You can prescribe it without going through all the rigmarole, but in some states, they've decided that it's still a Schedule 5. The legislators are concerned about it. So the other problem is you have natural products. And years ago, unbeknownst to most people, the tobacco lobby funded a lot of natural products people to lobby for having natural products that, quote, don't contain any chemicals, which is sort of BS because everything is a chemical. So you can now market natural products without any federal rules whatsoever. And this is creating a lot of problems. Now, what's really interesting, and a lot of doctors didn't understand this, is that marijuana and cannabis laws are state laws. So physician's job is only to certify that the patient has a condition that the state has legislated as approval for these compounds. And so the doctor's role is simply to say this person has epilepsy, and then they can go to the dispensary. And this is entirely different than most medical practice, where the doctor actually says, okay, you have epilepsy, here's the pill you take, and you write a prescription for it. So what this does, it gets the MDs out of the federal law. And so theoretically, people like Jeff Sessions cannot go after doctors for, quote, certifying patients. However, they go after the pharmacies. And this was California actually developed this model law because the doctors in California were very, very upset about possibly being prosecuted at the federal level. So now a lot of doctors in Minnesota were concerned about this, but when you explain this to them, they understand that they're not in trouble. Now I'm going to just jump a little bit to some science. So when you take any pill, any medicine by mouth, it goes to the stomach, and what we're concerned about in pharmacy is how much actually gets into your bloodstream. And so this thing is called bioavailability, or F, and you may hear talk about bioavailability of generic products versus, the branded product. So bioavailability is a very important thing that you have to worry about. Now, if you take 100 milligram pill, that 100 milligrams usually does not get into your bloodstream. If you give it IV, 100 milligram gets in. So we often measure bioavailability by intravenous versus what's in the blood. So as soon as you take a pill, the first thing that happens, it goes to the stomach, it goes to the gut, and it goes to the liver, it gets metabolized. And so generally, very little of many drugs. Some drugs have 100% bioavailability, but there was very little research done on bioavailability of oral cannabis because people smoked it. But there's some literature from way back 20-some years ago that suggested that CBD is only 25 to 25% bioavailable. That is a very, very low level of bioavailability. So it means if you take 100 milligrams of CBD, only 5 to 25 milligrams gets into your bloodstream. But this was a very poor old study, so we repeated the study in our clinic. And what we did, we got some of our patients who took their CBD either without breakfast or with a high-fat breakfast. Which is a breakfast burrito. FDA actually classifies a breakfast burrito as a standard research fatty breakfast. So just remember that next time you have a breakfast burrito. So we got, the Minnesota law didn't allow the company to give us free CBD, so for $5, we got our patients, got a month's supply. of CBD manufactured by this one company. I can get 98% pure CBD, which is really quite a trick because CBD is a very, very hard fat. It's almost like wax. And if you take it on an empty stomach, anyway, so make a long story short, we took blood samples for up to 96 hours and we randomized them to take it with breakfast or not breakfast 2 weeks later. And here's what we got. This is a semi-log scale. The blue is if you took it on an empty stomach. The red is if you took it with your quote fatty breakfast. So we measure CBD concentrations in nanograms per milliliter. Does anybody know what a nanogram is? Okay, so a milligram is 1/1000th of a gram. A microgram is 1/1000th of a milligram. A nanogram is 1/1000th of a microgram. So we're talking 10 to the minus 9. Yeah. So the CBD in your blood is a very, very low concentration, much lower than many of our other medications. And so we did the study and we found that for a 100 milligram dose during steady state, which is when you're taking it for many days, with the fed you get roughly 1,000 nanograms per milliliter. If you take it on a fasting, you only get 160. So that's almost a 5-fold difference. So now we get to the pizza. Okay. So we published this article some years ago about how, now this was, nobody else had done a study like this before because we can't do this study if you're smoking it. You have to have a pill that's 98% pure, and then you have to have machinery that can measure down to nanogram quantities, which we have at the university. So we published the study in an international journal, and when you publish something that's interesting medically, a lot of lay journals pick it up, and my favorite article was in a lay journal that talked about a pizzeria in Colorado that actually had been putting CBD oil on their pizza for years. And the point of their article was that this pizzeria had been doing the scientifically correct thing all these years, and now we have evidence to prove scientifically that if you are going to use CBD, take it with some fatty food. So that's really the end of my lecture. Thank you very much. Yeah, questions?
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, what you saw there, I thought if you take any kind of drug fasting, it would actually be a higher concentration in your system instead of the other way around. Your research showed that you eat it with food and you get a better concentration. Is that what I understood?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
Okay, well, normally common sense would say if you take any kind of drug while fasting, more would get into your system. But your research showed just the opposite.
Well, actually, common sense doesn't always work.
Yeah, so.
So if you take a water-soluble drug and you don't take it with any liquid, or you're on totally empty stomach, so in order for something to get absorbed, it has to dissolve. Mm-hmm. And let's say you take something like Neurology, which is very water-soluble, and you haven't had anything to drink and you're a little dehydrated, it's not going to absorb nearly as well as if you take it with some water. And most people, they say take your pill with a little slug of water, right? So, and if you have a fatty drug like CBD, you need to take it with a little bit of fatty that then helps dissolve the CBD in the fat, and then it gets into the gut better. Otherwise, they just stay there like a lump.
Wow.
Okay.